I would like to welcome everybody to the 3:30 panel on U.S. China relations. My name is Iain Johnston. I teach in the government department here at Harvard. The panelists today are a superb collection of experts in a range of topics in U.S. China relations, so I won't say much more than that. The panel reflects, I think, on the expertise of the panel reflects on the complexity of U.S. China relations, the fact that there is both cooperative as well as non-cooperative elements in the relationship. We forget actually how much cooperation there is among states. There's a data set called events data set, which basically tracks all actions by each state towards another state through collections of media coverage, and then codes the verbs, the actions that people do, countries do to each other, along a cooperative, non-cooperative dimension. And if you look, for example, at back to 1999, the proportion of Chinese actions that are recorded in the media, and this could be minor actions, it could be major actions, but the proportion of actions that actually fall within the cooperative category, roughly about 70% of the time, the actions are actually classified as cooperative. Now, these could be minor, they could be major, but it suggests there is a tremendous complexity here. So, I want to introduce the panelists. We'll ask them to make roughly 15 minutes each remarks, and then we'll open up to the audience for questions. First up will be Mr. Ryan Haas, who is the Director of China at China Affairs, China Policy at the National Security Council in Washington. So he will, a longtime expert on China, has spent time in the State Department working on China issues and now handles China issues in the White House, and will give his perspective from Washington on the complexity of U.S.-China relations. Then we'll go to Taylor Fravel, who is the world's leading expert on China's handling of territorial disputes, and we will move to that fairly unstable element of U.S.-China relations as he talks about U.S.-China interactions in the East China Sea and South China Sea. And then we'll move to Professor Steve Goldstein, one of the world's top experts on cross-strait relations, who will look at the China-Taiwan relationship from the perspective of U.S.-China relations. And then finally, Professor Kelly Gallagher from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, who's an expert on China and climate change, and who spent some recent amount of time advising the U.S. government on its climate change policy towards and cooperation with China. So she's an expert on that. And she'll talk about that element of cooperation in the U.S.-China relations. So let's start with Ryan Haas.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Johnston for having me on this panel, and also to congratulate the Fairbank Center on 60 years of achievement and deepening our understanding of China. So I have had the opportunity to serve at the White House for the past 3+ years. During that period, I've had the opportunity to travel with the President twice to China, with the National Security Advisor 3 times to China, and to be a participant in countless other meetings in Washington and elsewhere. And during this period, I've observed a couple of important trends develop in the relationship. One of them has captured a lot of attention, several of them have not. So my goal today is to try to share the perspective that I have been able to observe over the past several years with you. And hopefully it will generate a lively discussion during our Q&A period. But before talking about the trends that I've observed, I'd like to just take 2 minutes to talk about what it is that we, the Obama administration, are trying to do with China. From the outset, this administration determined that our ability to solve major challenges would be enhanced if China was playing an active role, if they were invested in solving problems with us. And so that's why we have invested so much time and energy working with China on issues such as the global economic recovery, Iran nuclear deal, climate change, Afghanistan, North Korea, pandemic disease. The list goes on and on. And in all of these areas, China has and will continue to play a very important and consequential role. We also decided early on in the administration that the organizing principle of our strategy would be to shape China's choices as a rising power. Now, for an observant group such as you, I think that you can infer from that we accept China's rise, we don't seek to impede it, and that we are seeking to shape the choices of China, not to change China. So in practical terms, what this means is that we are encouraging China to serve as an engine of global growth and to take on a greater burden of responsibility with us in addressing the challenges of our time. We're also seeking to discourage China from actions that undermine the efficacy of the rules-based international order, challenge our national interest, or harm our allies and partners. So to advance these objectives, we've invested in an approach that really has three core components. The first is increased engagement at senior levels, and President Obama has met with his Chinese counterparts more than any president in the history of the United States. Two, increased efforts to invest and embed China in international institutions. And three, deepen relationships with countries around China to create an environment around China that would encourage the emergence of a peaceful and stable China. So together, these lines of efforts are intended to bring about a relationship that is defined by expanding cooperation and constructive management of differences. In a nutshell, that's been the consistent approach of the Obama administration over the past 8 years towards China. So with that as backdrop, a few of the developments or trends that I've had an opportunity to observe. Number one, the most visible and prominent feature of this relationship is growing competition. That is what we can read about on a daily basis in the newspaper. It's real. There is rising competition. We have serious concerns about China's approach in certain areas, such as on maritime disputes, its activities in domains such as space and cyber, its human rights record, its economic practices that give an unfair advantage to Chinese firms over U.S. competitors, and so on. In fairness, the Chinese have their own list of concerns about our actions, and they are equally candid in raising them with us. This rising competition likely reflects a combination of factors, several of which include that China is now a more central actor on the global stage than it has been in the past. China has a greater tolerance for friction with us and with others than it has in the past. China pursues its interests with a greater degree of determination and muscle. And the share of global attention devoted to China is higher than it has been in the past. But I would put that as one trend, not the definition of the relationship. The second trend or development, as Professor Johnston mentioned, is growing cooperation. At the same time as competition is rising, so is cooperation. This is, in some extent, the paradox of the relationship. I think a reasonable case could be made that there is more cooperation in the U.S. China relationship now than there has been at any point in the history of the U.S. China relationship. And I'll offer just a few illustrative examples, and happy to talk about them further if there's interest. On Iran, it would have been extremely difficult to reach the deal that we did if China had not reduced its purchases of Iranian oil to build pressure on Tehran. Climate change, Kelly will talk about this later, but I think that China's role was probably the most impactful variable to us reaching the Paris Agreement. China's role in Montreal this week was one of the most impactful variables in reaching an airline's emission reduction agreement. And next week in Kigali, Rwanda, China will play a prominent role in whether or not we achieve progress on reducing HFCs. Ebola. Several years ago, there was an outbreak of Ebola in West Africa. U.S. and Chinese healthcare workers labored side by side to save lives in West Africa. And that cooperation didn't stop, it actually continued. And our healthcare workers are now working side by side to stand up a Center for Disease Control at the African Union headquarters. Nuclear security. Not a highly visible area of cooperation, but a real one. We're working together to convert nuclear reactors in places like Ghana, Nigeria, so that they become less of a proliferation risk. Afghanistan. In 2009, there really wasn't discussion between the United States and China and Afghanistan. Now our two countries are central players in the quadrilateral group with Afghanistan and Pakistan and trying to push forward reconciliation. Peacekeeping, the U.S. and China are leading global efforts to build capacity both in Africa and around the world. So the list can go on and on. I just wanted to provide a few illustrative examples to make the point that we now cooperate on a more diverse set of issues that have more impact to U.S. interests than we have, I think, at any point in the history of the relationship. So that's the second major development. The third major development, there's more and better cooperation now than there has been in the past. The channels of communication between our two countries have become more diverse. The quality and depth of communication has become better. I think that some people in this room can remember the days in the not too distant past when many of our bilateral interactions focused on the 3 Ts, Taiwan, Tibet, and trade. And it was very difficult to move past rote recitation of talking points on those issues. We still talk about those issues. They're still important issues, but they're not limiting or defining issues. We now talk about virtually every issue in the human condition when our leaders meet. When President Xi hosted President Obama in Hangzhou, they spent nearly 6 hours together. And over the course of those 6 hours, using simultaneous interpretation, they covered almost every issue you can imagine. So I guess my broader point is it's not just the president as well. On any given week, the Attorney General, the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Secretary of State, EPA Administrator, they're all talking directly with their counterparts in Beijing. And what this does is it leads to greater clarity of each side's intentions, which produces greater predictability. Predictability is the predicate of stability. And I think that the quality and the diversity of communication has had a stabilizing effect on the relationship. So that's the third development that I have observed. And then the fourth, and this is somewhat related, is there's been a real structural strengthening of the bilateral relationship over the recent years. And what I mean by that is that our capacity for managing and addressing and resolving challenges is progressively growing stronger. On the military side, we have established confidence-building measures that increase transparency and predictability of operational behavior, and it has had the effect of reducing risk of unintended incidents. So even though our forces operate in closer proximity more frequently, the risk of unintended incidents has gone down, operational safety has gone up. On cyber issues, there has been an observable shift in Chinese behavior over the past year since our two leaders reached a 4-point cyber agreement last September. To be fair, we still have serious concerns about Chinese activities in cyberspace, their treatment of U.S. firms in China. So I don't want to gloss over the problems, but merely to make the point that we have mechanisms in place now that did not previously exist to help manage problems, address incidents when they occur. There's also been a dramatic increase in investment, in trade, in travel between both countries, and this has provided a foundational support to the relationship as well that is stabilizing. So cumulatively, I would argue that the risk of major incidents has gone down, and our ability to manage and solve problems has gone up. So where does this leave us? I think that none of the trends that I have just laid out obscures the fact that we have real differences with China on important issues that could lead to intensified competition if not managed well. We certainly are not naive to the challenges on the horizon. But we also think that it's worth bearing in mind the arc of progress that has emerged over recent years, which is often obscured or overshadowed by the focus of the media and the expert community on areas of tension in the relationship. So from where I sit at the National Security Council, my view is that this relationship is too complex, it's too consequential to be boiled down to bumper sticker slogans. To describe the relationship as a great power rivalry would be to capture one facet of a multifaceted relationship. So hopefully, in these brief remarks, I have done a bit to illuminate a bit of the arc of progress that is underway in the bilateral relationship, and contributed to what I hope will be a lively Q&A. So while major challenges remain, I think that the relationship is becoming more durable, more resilient, and more productive. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ryan. So next up is Taylor Fravel to talk about maritime issues.
Thanks, Ian, for having me at this wonderful symposium, and thanks to the Fairbank Center for all the work that you've done on China studies, and thanks in particular for allowing me to be a visiting scholar several years ago. It was a tremendous experience to be a part of this community then. So I was asked to talk about maritime disputes in U.S. China relations, and given that we are commemorating here the 60th anniversary of the Fairbank Center, I thought I would commemorate the 70th anniversary of U.S. involvement in China's maritime disputes. To add some levity to the discussion of what is otherwise a serious topic, and also to provide some context from what I would call the prehistoric period in these disputes, or sort of the period after the end of the Second World War. I'll do that, and then I'll talk a little bit about the post-Cold War period, and then the post-9/11 period, bringing us up to the present. And if we have time, I'll talk a little bit about these disputes in a broader context. So turning to what I call sort of the prehistoric period, or the post-Cold War period, the U.S. is actually much more involved than I think is commonly known. So in 1946, the Republic of China sent several ships to the Paracel Islands and then to the Spratly Islands to assert the Republic of China's sovereignty claims over these features. What is less well known is that two of these ships, the ROCS Zhongye and the ROCS Taiping, were U.S. naval warships that had been leased to the Republic of China. So without our efforts to bolster the Republic of China Navy, they would not have been able to conduct this voyage at great distance from China in somewhat treacherous seas to lay China's claim. And it's not a coincidence that Woody Island was named Zhongye in the Paracels after that vessel, which was a minesweeper, not a pretty significant military ship. And then Taiping Island was named after the ROCS Taiping, which was a destroyer escort. In the mid-1960s, the United States, in the context of Vietnam War, routinely violated the territorial waters and airspace over the Paracels, including Woody Island, or Yongxing Island, which was occupied by China at the time. In fact, Chinese documents record 497 protests of violations of their airspace, but from 1958 to 1971. In the mid-1960s, the United States started using Scarborough Shoal, which is a small rocky outcrop disputed between China and the Philippines today, as a bombing range. In fact, the United States Navy was allowed to declare a 20-mile U.S. Navy operating area in order to keep civilian vessels away so that they wouldn't be damaged during these training exercises. Between 1969 and 1971, the United States under ROC flag operated a radar station on Taiping Island in the Spratlys. In 1974, when the PRC clashed with South Vietnam over the Crescent Group in the Paracels, it captured Vietnamese soldiers who had been placed on Paddle Island, but among those Vietnamese soldiers was an American observer observing the combat. In the 1970s, two of the roughly 7 features in the Senkaku Islands were used as a bombing range for the U.S. Navy as well. So if you think today is bad, think what it was like before, when the United States was overflying the territorial airspace of these features and bombing them. So it's really not as bad as you think it might be. So moving on, how did we get to the current situation that we're in? Of course, at the time in the Cold War period, these islands weren't very important. People weren't thinking about maritime rights. The UN Convention, the law of the sea hadn't been concluded, and so that history is forgotten. I was sort of divided into U.S. involvement in 2 phases. So the first phase is sort of the post-Cold War phase. In late 1994, roughly December, China moved in and occupied the aptly named Mischief Reef, which is one of the reefs that comprise the Spratly Islands, and as pretty close to the Philippines, although it's also claimed by Vietnam. And in response to that, in May of 1995, the U.S. State Department issued a statement sort of outlining U.S. interests. It was actually served as the basis for a statement Secretary Clinton would give much later in 2010, but it sort of highlighted sort of the peaceful resolution of disputes and that the United States had a pretty serious national interest in freedom of navigation. After this statement, though, U.S. involvement kind of receded in China's maritime disputes, with one exception. The following year, in 1996, amid some tensions between China and Japan over the Senkaku Islands, the United States, at a fairly low level, I think Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, affirmed that the Senkaku Islands were in fact covered by the U.S.-Japan Defense Treaty under Article 5. But from sort of 95, 96, not much happened for about 10 years, which takes us to what I would call sort of the post-9/11 period. In this stage, the maritime disputes between China and its neighbors really begin to sort of kick off. I would so the starting point was probably 2006, and it kind of went public in 2009. Kind of by accident, the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. Yes, nobody's ever heard of that, right? It's a UN body under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, charged with assessing claims to extended continental shelves that states may make, but it's a technical body. They had set, in 1999, they had set a deadline of May of 2009 for states to submit their claims to extended continental shelves. And states like professors and students all submitted their claims at the very last minute, right? Rushing to meet the deadline. But in so doing, it brought to light and made public all of the various disputes that had kind of been simmering. Because what you could do in this body is you could issue basically a counterclaim or a note saying that this UN body should not rule on this on a particular extended continental shelf because it involved a dispute with another state. And so, following submissions by Vietnam, and Vietnam jointly with Malaysia, China objected, saying that they had sovereignty and maritime interests here. Those states then issued counterclaims, and things really spun up. And I can't review sort of the entire sort of last 8 years of tensions, especially in the South China Sea. But I want to leave you with this observation, because I think it bears upon how we think about the future. So the observation is that never before has China been more resolute or resolved to defend its maritime claims, especially those in the South China Sea. And never before has the United States been more involved in these disputes, even though the United States, as a matter of policy, does not take sides with or maintains a position of neutrality regarding the underlying sovereignty. So you can just think back at some of the key events on the Chinese side. In 2012, following a dispute over fishermen inside Scarborough Shoal, a tense standoff ensued between Chinese and Filipino maritime law enforcement vessels, which left China in control of the shoal, a pretty significant change in China's approach to these disputes. Shortly thereafter, China declared that all of the Paracels and the Spratlys were part of this prefectural level city in Hainan province called Sansha City, Sansha being the three sands of Xisha, Zhongsha, and Nansha. Perhaps China's largest administrative area, if one includes all the water space, right? CNOOC then issued, the China National Offshore Oil Company then issued exploration blocks smack in the middle of the South China Sea that overlapped, curiously enough, with those blocks that Vietnam had maintained for a very long period of time. Moreover, China could not justify exploration of these blocks based upon their sort of proximity within China's exclusive economic zone, not just because China hadn't declared one yet, but also because if one looked at a map and drew out 200 nautical mile range rings from various features, you would see that these blocks were really far from any land feature from which China could make such a claim. In 2013, China sort of various times sought to blockade Scarborough Shoal. In 2014, it moved a massive oil rig, the Haiyang Shiryo 981, a $1 billion semi-submersible deep water drilling rig, into waters off the Paracels, but within Vietnam's coastal EEZ, sparking a pretty significant crisis with Vietnam. And then, of course, this all culminates with land reclamation activities of all of the features that China has occupied in the Spratlys which has produced, I don't know what the precise number now is, 5 square miles of territory. A really significant change. That's on the Chinese side. On the U.S. side, the U.S. has spoken out with sort of increasing frequency and concern since July of 2010 at the ASEAN Regional Forum. When the pivot was rolled out in 2011, the context seemed to be pretty much the South China Sea. It wasn't stated, but it had a lot to do with these disputes. And absent those disputes, I think it would have been viewed differently. Throughout this period, especially in 2014, the United States began, as Ryan mentioned, to deepen relations with China's neighbors, but especially at a military level, resulting in an agreement with the Philippines, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which opened up, had the potential to open up lots of facilities to U.S. Airplanes and warships. And then starting in sort of October of 2015, the United States began to conduct a pretty public freedom of navigation operation program against China. And what made this different from the programs that have been around forever, but what made this different was that they were sort of publicly announced, which sort of was rubbing it in China's face a little bit and somewhat uncharacteristic. So in this way, right, we have sort of a slow-moving spiral, and I think we're at a turning point. And the question is this going to become a symptom of a much greater sort of great power rivalry and competition? Not to reduce it to that, but certainly in the competitive side of the relationship, this could be one of the big issues, along with Taiwan, that is going to shape U.S.-China relations in the future. And it's hard to say, right? But I would leave you with this. We do have this sort of slow-moving spiral. China believes it's acting in defensive terms. These are long-standing claims. Certainly as a modern nation-state, China's claim to the Spratlys goes back to 1951. And the Parasols, China, that's when the PRC first issued its claims. Previous Chinese governments had claims. The U.S. believes it's defending international rules as enshrined in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, right? So both countries are kind of standing on principle here. One, national sovereignty, the other sort of international law and commonly accepted norms and rules of behavior. And that's dangerous, right? When you stand on principle, it's much harder to find a way to sort of to disentangle the conflict. China's assertiveness in the South China Sea has raised many questions in the United States about broader Chinese intentions. So that may be unwarranted since it is a territorial dispute, and how states act in territorial disputes doesn't necessarily reflect how they'll act in other kinds of conflicts. But nevertheless, the perception is there. And from China's perspective, the U.S. has been pretty darn assertive in the South China Sea, right? Especially when a CNN crew boarded a P-8 surveillance aircraft, which was monitoring China's land reclamation. That may have been done to sort of communicate to states in the region sort of U.S. commitment and resolve. But at the same time, I think it communicated to many in China that the United States was going to stick its finger in these disputes and do so in a very public way. And in fact, that footage, sort of now stock footage that is shown on CCTV in Beijing, and not in a helpful way. So currently, we're sort of in a period of calm. So the question is, has a new equilibrium been formed, or is this just the eye in the storm? So what would the argument be for a new equilibrium? Actually, take one step back here. Why are we in a period of calm? I mean, the main reason probably has to do with the ruling of the tribunal, which was brought by the Philippines in early 2013 and reached a conclusion in July of this year. It was a tribunal set up under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It had 15 submissions or claims, and the tribunal basically found in favor of the Philippines and against China on 13.5 out of the 15 claims. It was much more lopsided than I certainly had expected, and I think many other international lawyers had expected. At the same time, the United States and the Philippines did not seize that opportunity to press China, which I think would have elicited a very sharp response. And so you had sort of this international reaction through the tribunal, coupled with, I think, a very measured response from the United States, and in particular from the Philippines, that has sort of led to, I think is behind this period of calm, but it sort of predates July. Now, it could be, here's the positive story, right? China has considerably, as I mentioned, strengthened its position in these disputes, right? It is, as one Chinese friend said to me, it is now Lao Da, right? It's now the big brother in the South China Sea because it occupies the largest islands. Now, some of them were not naturally formed, but setting that aside, they are the largest islands, right? 3 airfields, as many airfields as all the other claimants have combined. I don't think that was actually an accident, right? So why is this important? Historically, in China's other territorial disputes, when it's been in a position of relative strength, it's been much more willing either to moderate or even ultimately compromise. And so this may actually sort of give China confidence not to press things further. We don't know, of course, but at least I think there's some basis in China's past behavior to suggest this might be the case. So that's sort of the positive story, and I think if that creates conditions for talks and for various modus vivendi to be reached among China and other states in these disputes, that's all to the good from a perspective of maintaining peace and stability. The negative interpretation would be that this calm we're seeing is just the eye of the storm, right? That we've seen tactical pauses, particularly out of Beijing since 2009, 2010. The first was from the midpoint of 2011 until Scarborough Shoal, and maybe this is sort of a second one, and it's sort of, I would sort of date it with Xi Jinping's statement when he visited Washington in September 2015 that China had no intention to militarize the Spratly Islands. Of course, that left open what militarization means, but nevertheless, it was, I think, a pretty important statement by China's top leader. But it could just be the case that China, having this newfound strength, will want to press its advantage. After all, these airfields and the harbors that were created in the reclaimed features provide an enormous platform for maintaining a forward presence in the southern portion of the South China Sea, where China has historically been quite weak. And so it's uncertain as to how this will unfold, but I think territorial disputes are inherently reactive, which is why we can see these spirals, but you can also break these spirals. And so although I study international security, I'm actually an optimist by nature. Mm-hmm. and so I will conclude expressing some optimism that this is not going to become, maritime disputes are not going to become kind of the central security issue defining U.S.-China relations. That, given all the factors that Ryan mentioned, as well as sort of some factors inherent to these disputes themselves, we may be sort of reaching a new period of stability and equilibrium. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Steve Goldstein.
Before I start, I should say two things about myself. The first thing is that for about the last 15 years, I've been organizing a group from Harvard and other universities to travel to both China and Taiwan. And we've been very fortunate in having excellent access, excellent candid conversations on both the mainland and Taiwan. Second point about myself. I am a great fan of time travel science fiction. I'm Timeless, the new series. I can't wait to see that unfold. The Man in the High Castle has been a great one. Don't miss that. And of course, there's always Westworld. Now, you think that if you put those two things together, what I'm about to say is when you travel to China and Taiwan for 15 years, it's like being in a different universe at each stop. You think that maybe what I'm going to do is going to talk about how this group of prestigious scholars was able to change minds in both Taiwan and the mainland. Well, I can assure you that having gone to Taiwan and the mainland for 15 years to talk about Taiwan, to my knowledge, has not changed anybody's view in either one of those places. But what it has done is it has given the opportunity to be at the cusp, really, of a very profound change that's occurred in cross-strait relations. So what I'd like to do is take the time travel part and pretend first that it's 60 years ago when the Fairbank Center was founded, And if some prehistoric Ian asked me to give a talk, what I might say in 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and then talk a little bit about the changes that we were able to witness. And I think we were very fortunate to be able to witness those changes. And talk about the changes in terms of American policy and in terms of the challenges to American policy. So let's go back 60 years, and I'd be talking about Taiwan, and I'd be talking about cross-strait relations. And the first thing that I'd say is probably the Civil War continues. The government on Taiwan, the Republic of China, does not consider itself an exile government. It considers itself to be the legitimate government of China that is trying to defeat a bandit regime and is temporarily stationed on Taiwan, but that it will recover the mainland, and that it sees itself, most importantly, not as the government of Taiwan, but it sees itself as the government of all of China. A lot follows from that. First place, what occurred in the early 50s was the signification of Taiwan. When the KMT troops, when the Kuomintang troops came to Taiwan, they found a population, 20 to 30% of whom spoke Japanese, most of whom could not speak whatever you want to call it, Putonghua or Goyu. When they set up the greetings for the troops landing from the mainland, they hung the Taiwan flag upside, they hung the Republic of China flag upside down because they didn't know which side was up. This was a population that since 1895 had lived as Japanese. And the result of that was that the government that came from the mainland had to, in effect, re-socialize or change the identity of the people of Taiwan, as well as changing the identity of the island of Taiwan to the Republic of China. So Taiwan, under the Kuomintang, as the temporary home of a national government, underwent a change of identity. And it was a forced change of identity. It was an enforced change of identity. And it came to be, really, China on the island of Taiwan. Now, what was American policy? American policy was, of course, the thing about American policy is that it evolved. Up until June of 1950, up until the Korean War, the United States was pretty much ready, or was ready, to write off Taiwan, to give up on Taiwan. It had been too many years of frustration, and Truman made this speech, or made a speech in January that fundamentally said we had no interest in Taiwan. With the invasion of Korea, everything changed. The United States did two things. It neutralized the Taiwan Straits, quote, neutralized, really to defend the government on Taiwan. But most importantly, and most profoundly, Truman reneged on the Cairo Conference and said that the status of Taiwan would be unsettled until a peace treaty with Japan or action by the United Nations. In other words, in June of 1950, American policy became that the island of Taiwan not the government of Taiwan. You've got to distinguish between those two things. The island of Taiwan did not belong to China, necessarily. That was the first step of American policy. The second part of American policy, John Forster Dulles, who was not as rabid or as anti-communist as he's often presented, John Forster Dulles saw the solution to the Chinese Civil War as the division of China in a manner similar to the division of East and West Germany or North and South Korea. And we began negotiations with the Chinese that lasted well into the 1970s, with that as our objective. But we also had a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. So we were committed to the protection of Taiwan, maybe, you have to read the treaty, but we were trying to separate the two, and that was Dulles's answer. Now, the point of all that is that what frustrated Dulles's goal was the fact that neither side was interested in that solution. Both Chiang Kai-shek and Mao agreed on one thing. They agreed that Taiwan was a part of China. They agreed that China should not be divided. Their only difference was who rules China. And so, ironically, that was a period when the concept of one China was most deeply inculcated on both sides. Okay. That's what I would have said then. I would have said this is a very difficult situation, this is American policy, but I probably wouldn't have known American policy because the negotiations with the Chinese were classified, but I'd be able to guess. That was a joke. Fast forward to today, okay? Today, it's very different. Today, as far as Taiwan is concerned, the battle's over. As far as Taiwan is concerned, there is no civil war. As part of the democratization process, all of the special legislation that had been put into place to justify Kuomintang autocracy, because there was a civil war, was repealed. So de facto, what Taiwan was saying was the civil war is over, and now it's time, and this of course was the crux, the Civil War was over, and now it's time for the two sides, on the basis of equality and on the basis of recognition that Taiwan is a sovereign independent state and has been that since 1912. The Taiwan argument is now we must, on those two bases, negotiate some kind of a new relationship. The second thing that happened on Taiwan was that its identity, during these last 15 years that we've been going, that its identity changed. Taiwan, or the citizens of Taiwan, now that they had the opportunity to express their views, the citizens of Taiwan no longer consider themselves, or their identity was no longer as living in a nation state that was governing China. Their identity became that of people on Taiwan living on Taiwan, a Taiwanese identity, which has only increased since then. So Taiwan fundamentally changed. Taiwan fundamentally viewed itself differently and its relationship with the mainland differently. On the mainland side, nothing changed. As some of you heard me say many times, the mainland is pursuing a 1980s policy towards Taiwan of the 21st century. And it's just not appealing. It isn't talking to this new Taiwan. So where's the United States? The United States is in the middle. That's the one consistent thing from the Marshall Mission of the late 1940s until today. The United States is in the middle, blamed by both sides for blamed by Taiwan for its inability to have a sovereign status in the world. Because as far as the United States is concerned, the status of Taiwan is unsettled, and the government of Taiwan is not a sovereign state. So we frustrate Taiwan and its ambitions, and of course we frustrate the mainland on its ambitions. So we're an equal opportunity obstructor. As far as the Taiwan Straits are concerned, and we pursue a very simple, we being the United States, a very simple policy in a very complex situation, and that is that the United States has no concern over what the result of a set of negotiations between the mainland and China might be. The only thing we insist is that it be a result of negotiations with the assent of both sides. And that, of course, if you accept what I said about the asymmetry in the two views at the moment, is not going to happen. So American policy today is in a very is in the same position it was, as I say, in the late 40s, of being a balancer in a very complex and a very dangerous situation, which relies in great part upon the good sense, patience of the two actors. And these are two actors that are increasingly in their views of each other and their views of the relationship growing apart. So that's not a very positive picture. There might be other more positive pictures out there if you accept my argument about alternative universes, but that's the universe that we live in, and it's a universe that I'm sure our friend from the White House would acknowledge is a very difficult one to maneuver in. Thank you.
And Professor Kelly Gallagher.
There's the glasses. Who needs their glasses? All right, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here and to help celebrate the 60th anniversary, so congratulations to the Fairbank Center. I'm going to use my time to try to discuss the remarkable fact that climate change became the bright spot, or at least a bright spot, in U.S. China relations. And it is pretty remarkable, because only a few years ago, that would have almost been considered impossible. And so I think what I'm going to be trying to do for you is provide you with a case study of surprising cooperation after years and years of contention on a particular issue. I'm not sure how generalizable this case is, and that's something that we can talk about maybe in the Q&A. And I want to acknowledge right up front that I make these remarks as as a professor, and I'm going to try and be as objective as I possibly can, but I'm not fully objective because I participated in this as an advisor working in the White House and in the State Department to these negotiations. But I'll try not to be defensive. So let me just quickly review, for the benefit of everybody here who may not be as familiar with this issue, what happened. So in 2014, the United States proposed to China that we try to explore some kind of agreement on climate change and try to break through what had been characterized as a suicide pact between the two countries. Why a suicide pact? Well, the idea was that each country was sort of using the other country as an excuse for inaction, and someday, we would all go down in flames with global warming. So the United States decided to make this proposal very quietly, very carefully, and the Chinese kind of surprisingly accepted this idea of trying to negotiate an agreement. And so at the Obama-Xi summit of 2014 came out what is known as the joint announcement. And this was an announcement that each country put forward kind of independently their targets for emissions reductions in the post-2020 period. And this jargon, if you'll forgive me, all derives from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations. But China, for the very first time, made a public commitment to reduce its emissions far below business as usual, the expected business as usual emissions, and to peak its emissions around 2030 with best efforts to peak early. That was a very important clause. And also to achieve a 20% non-fossil primary energy target in the same time period. And for its part, the United States committed to a 26 to 28% reduction from 2005 levels in greenhouse gas emissions, with best efforts to reach 28%. So in essence, these were nationally determined targets. That was a very important principle of the negotiation between the two countries. But I think it's fair to say that the two countries kind of catalyzed each other to show ambition, and neither country would have stood up with the other one if there hadn't been a sense that these were respectable targets. This proved to be very catalytic. As a result of this U.S. China announcement, many other countries came forward with their commitments for this post-2020 time period. And actually, the United States was able to engage in very productive discussions with India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, and many others. And there were even a couple of additional bilateral announcements. And I think in particular the one with the Mexicans was very instructive in terms of this conversation, because the Mexicans decided to peak their emissions by 2026. So they beat the Chinese by 4 years. But it just gives you a sense that this was catalytic and inspired other countries to act. And all of this was happening in the context of the global negotiations on climate change, and a deadline had been scheduled by the international community of December 2015 to try and reach, once and for all, a global agreement on climate change. So the fact that all these countries were coming forward early, well in advance of those final negotiations, which were to take place in Paris, was very productive. Because in the end, as we got to Paris, actually almost every country in the world had already made a pledge, rather than having to negotiate those pledges in Paris. So right before the Paris Agreement, there was a second, well, not the second, but there was a subsequent Obama-Xi summit, and it was held in Washington. And so the decision was to try and really focus on implementation, and that the United States and China were going to proceed to honor their pledges no matter what happened in Paris. It was kind of a, we're not waiting for Paris, we're getting going, we're implementing our own bilateral agreement anyway. And this ended up being called the joint statement. And so again, we had a presidential statement, and in this statement, kind of a vision for Paris was laid out, and that was very important because it resolved a number of very difficult issues between the United States and China in the context of the global negotiations. We commenced what I think is a very productive pattern of synchronization of domestic policy implementation steps, whether it's regulating the power sector or the fuel efficiency standards for motor vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles, taking important steps to reduce hydrofluorocarbons. All of this was included in the agreement. Also, a very important announcement from the Chinese that they would contribute to global climate finance, and establishment of something called the Climate Leaders Summit, which is designed to encourage subnational action on climate change. And then this year, at the most recent announcement, or most recent presidential summit, we had the two countries accept the Paris Agreement. And that, I think, really catalyzed a lot of countries to go ahead and continue their ratification procedures. And many of you may have seen that, I think this week or last week, the Europeans just agreed to ratify, and so now the Paris Agreement on climate change can enter into force, all of which is very exciting. So we can consider this, a great success that many people, including myself, even though I suggested this idea in the first place, I think if I had to put a probability for success, it would have been very low. So the fact that we had all of the success, and in fact, all these spillover successes that we never really anticipated, is worth thinking about. How did we get there? So that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my time. So why was China interested in doing this? I'm not Chinese, I can't say for sure, but I've spent a lot of my research career in China. And I think it's fair to say that for the Chinese government, they saw acting on climate as very consistent with their own economic development objectives and strategies. In particular, trying to move to a less resource-intensive economy and trying to shift the composition of their economy away from heavy industry and towards lighter service-based economy. So any action that could be taken to reduce energy consumption, reduce coal consumption, would be helpful. I think China was also newly but acutely conscious of its status as the largest emitter in the world on an aggregate basis, and I hasten to add, not on a per capita basis. But China had surpassed the United States in global greenhouse gas emissions around 2006. And so I think China was uncomfortable with the fact that it was now the leading emitter. Also, the severe challenges related to conventional, regular, old-fashioned air pollution, are really obvious for anyone who's been to China lately. And I think pursuing win-win strategies for reducing conventional air pollution and also reducing greenhouse gas emissions seemed like an obviously good idea to the Chinese government, at least the central government. And I think we can say that the non-fossil target is certainly consistent with China's energy security goals. So it's not at all surprising that China also wanted a non-fossil target as part of this agreement. I think also, why the U.S.? And my answer to that is that it's easier to negotiate with one party than with 195. And in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change context, very complicated to negotiate with so many parties. China was sort of boxed into a coalition in the UN context of the G77 and China, which had really diverse, but I think increasingly divergent interests from China. And so breaking out of that in a way that was complementary to the process and viewed as catalytic to the process was really helpful. And certainly just having one party to negotiate with is a lot easier. And then now I have three perhapses. Perhaps China wanted to demonstrate that it could be a responsible stakeholder, and I know that that's a U.S. term. But I think it did kind of exemplify the notion that Xi Jinping had started popularizing of this new theory of great power relations, that China could step forward and show leadership on a global issue, and climate change was an acceptable vehicle for doing that. I also think perhaps China wanted to demonstrate maturity in the U.S. China relationship, and that kind of is on the lines of what Ryan was talking about. And to demonstrate that we could be constructive on some issues even when we had contention on other issues. On the U.S. side, I think, frankly, we might have had less obviously strategic motives, though arguably, in fact, they were as strategic. But I think at the time that the United States made this suggestion, there was a very strong feeling on the part of President Obama that he personally had not done enough on climate change, and he wanted to do more, and he was stymied in the domestic context, and he could do something in the international context. He had just established the Climate Action Plan, which had three areas of focus. One was domestic mitigation, domestic resilience, and the third area was U.S. leadership internationally. And this kind of fit in with that Climate Action Plan. I also think, in a way, the process was unique, which I learned sort of later, because by the time I got down there, the negotiations were already in place. But it was a very small team on the U.S. side that was involved in the negotiations, and it wasn't more widely known in the U.S. government. And I think there was less blockage than there might have been if it had been more widely known. It was more difficult for the second agreement because at that point, you know, this new thing had happened. I think the U.S. government was super driven by the desire to create the conditions for success in Paris in the UNFCCC context, and less driven by the desire to have a productive U.S.-China relationship. Though after the fact, I think the U.S. was kind of thrilled that there was this positive area in the bilateral relationship. And I think also in the climate policy context, there was recognition that there'd be really good political benefits in the United States if China was acting. It would undermine the argument in the Congress that the U.S. should do nothing because China wasn't acting. But, you know, the kind of surprising thing is that, to the extent I'm aware of it, there really weren't a lot of U.S.-China considerations. To my knowledge, no discussion of trade-offs among the issues we were negotiating with China about. And so that also might have been why it was possible for the United States to do this. So now, just as I think about what are some of the key uncertainties about next steps, a lot of my uncertainties have to do with what will happen in China. And the first thing relates to the previous panel, which is what will economic growth look like in China going forward? If China is able to honor this agreement, it will have successfully transformed its economy. It will have achieved the economic reform that the central government desires. But it's not clear at all to me that the provincial governments and the state-owned enterprises have bought in to this reform. And that could really undermine China's ability to honor the agreement. Can structural change be achieved in the economy? I think, as some of you know, but much better than me, the tertiary or services sector of China's economy surpassed the secondary sector for the first time in 2013. So it does seem like, in general, China's economy is moving in the right direction compositionally. It will be much harder for China to achieve its target than it will be for the United States to achieve its target, in the sense that China's non-fossil target requires construction of non-fossil power equivalent to the entire U.S. electricity sector. So between now and 2030, China has to build as much power generation capacity as we have in the United States, and it has to be carbon-free. So that creates a lot of interesting opportunities, but also challenges. And so how China reaches this peak, and then what the trajectory after the peak looks like, is a really big question. Does China have a long, long plateau at essentially very high emissions, or will China be able to quickly reduce its emissions after it peaks? And what are some of the consequences of very rapid deployment of nuclear power? Because China does intend to rely heavily on nuclear power to achieve this non-fossil target. And then I think there's a lot of interesting questions about policy implementation and which policies will prove most effective in the Chinese context in achieving, once and for all green growth or low carbon growth. And if China is able to show that this is possible, that will really be inspiring for so many other developing countries that are looking for a new economic growth model. So let me just conclude with a few very quick kind of lessons that I take from this case study. The first was that, and this comes out of negotiation theory, ripeness. The time was ripe on both sides. President Obama was ready to do something. I don't think he was ready to do something in his first term, so the timing was very good on the U.S. side. And I think also on the Chinese side, Xi Jinping was established. He was willing to take a risk, and other senior people in the leadership agreed with that. There was difficulty in the sort of bureaucratic domestic process on both sides. From the U.S. side, it was often very hard to discern who we should be negotiating with. On the Chinese side, and I think on the U.S. side, our very slow, deliberative process sometimes slowed us down. One thing that was very effective was that we were able to kind of depoliticize the process by having a technical exchange. And I haven't described this in detail to you, but there was a technical exchange where we shared modeling results and assumptions about what we could do, and the Chinese did that for their part. And in fact, that process was very open and very productive and helped narrow the zone of possible agreement, which is another negotiating term, to a very narrow zone. And that was quite productive. I think the importance of pre-existing relationships and knowledge was also very important. Many of the negotiators on both sides had had a lot of experience working in the other country, studying the other country. Many people were old friends, and I think that really helped in terms of trust in the negotiations. We had many more positive spillovers from U.S. and Chinese leadership on climate than we expected, and so it raises this interesting question that if we could show and exercise more joint leadership, would that create more positive spillovers on other topics? I'm not sure whether these agreements embody this new theory of great power relations, but I'd be interested from the Chinese participants in the audience whether you think that it does. And then I'll stop on the lessons learned by saying that this was really a first step. And so for those of us who work on climate change issues, the progress we made was tremendous progress, and the fact that we got a Paris Agreement was a tremendous achievement, but it's really only the first step. And so to really address this issue, we have much more cooperation and collaboration between the United States and China will be necessary. Ian had asked us to conclude with some suggestions for future research. So let me just say, my first question is really this kind of academic jargon, but is this case generalizable? Can we apply this case of cooperation to other issues? Can we think about how we could, spread cooperation? I think we're starting to see, as Ryan described, some interesting, intriguing instances of cooperation. For example, on Ebola is the one that is most striking to me. How do we create or maintain cooperation in the face of conflict in other areas? I really worry about whether this is a temporary bright spot in the U.S. China relationship or whether we can sustain it. How do we engage China as a responsible stakeholder if that's a good argument with China? And under what conditions will China act that way? And then last, as we think about other issues, how can we identify mutual gains on the topic? Because I think this is really why this worked. Both countries fundamentally saw this as in their interest, but that took, a sense of having enlightened self-interest and changing a prior position in order to do so.
Thank you very much. So we have some time for questions and answers. Wait for the microphone and then please identify yourself. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Chen Hao. I'm a PhD student at Boston University. So I have a question for Mr. Haas. And so you mentioned about there is a rising of competition between US and China, and there is also a rising of cooperation between the two countries. And also, as Professor Gallagher mentioned, the case of the climate change, the cooperation between the United States. So it seems to me like there is a contradictory on China that on one hand, President Xi is very in favor of to setting up a cooperation relationship with the United States. And for example, like in the meeting of G20 recently, President Xi spent like 6 hours with President Obama to talk about lots of issues. And Mr. Haas mentioned that there are several departments in the United States have regular contact with China. But on the other hand, we also see that China is doing something different. For example, like China is building.
Could you get the question?
Oh, right. So my question is, so from the perspective of the United States government, what's the perceptions of U.S. government on China's real intentions? And how does that affect U.S.-China relationships in the foreseeable future? Yeah.
Why don't we collect a couple more questions and then go to the answers? This side, yes. Yes.
Hi, Jing Su, Council on East Asian Studies at Yale. I actually have a question about, I hear most of the panelists talking about U.S.-China relations as though it's sort of between these two powers and it does not have only a little bit about the impact that it has on regional stability like Southeast Asia in particular. Going on the example you gave, that U.S. did not press China for a strong response after Philippines won the arbitration, is that, in fact, the day after, the ASEAN countries had issued a joint statement, drafted and ready to go, but in the next morning, Cambodia pulled out. And that very same day, Hon Sun received $600 million from China. So there's a sense in which the overt aggressive response that you might have thought you avoided just got driven kind of behind the scenes into this kind of buyouts. So I just wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
Over here? Yes, sir. Corner.
William Wade, CGS associate. I was wondering if I could offer a potential cause or factor that caused this deal. Between 2013 and 2014, there happened to be a couple conference where Mr. Kevin Rudd, the former Australia Prime Minister, talked more than once about, number one, he's very concerned about this complicated relationship between two countries. Number two, he actually offered a specific things that these two countries potentially could try. And again, he's been communicating between Beijing and Washington, D.C., as he said, 10 times in about 6 months in Beijing and D.C. talk to high-level government officers. So one of those suggestions that he said these countries he thought might try is climate change, in addition to anti-terrorism and nuclear security. So I was curious about, since he's high level and he presents himself, I guess, more or less neutral, and talking to high-level government officers, and it seemed to make sense that that will cause them, if nothing else, think about it and give it a try. Curious about all the panels, including Professor Kelly, and know anything about the potential, triggering and promotion of individual like this. And that will serve as a pretty interesting case about relationship between two countries.
Okay, thank you. One more on this side. Yes, sir.
Well, I just have a very meaty question. Stephen Lebo, I'm an associate, Stephen Lebo, I'm an associate here. I've also had about a 10-year association with Al Gore's Climate Reality Project, and I want a specific question about China. It seems to me, though, that one shouldn't discount the reality that, like Margaret Thatcher or Angela Merkel, what we understand about Xi Jinping's education, unlike an awful lot of leaders around the world, is he has the personal education to understand the scientific issues associated with the existential, challenge of climate change. And one assumes that must play some role in all of this. He can read the charts.
Great. Okay. So those are great questions, and why don't we start with answers? Ryan, do you want to go first? Was there anything that you felt was addressed to you and could respond to?
Well, I would actually like to defer to the true experts on this panel, but
Okay.
I would just offer a few general observations to sort of kick off the response. I think one of the things that we're trying to do, both with China and also in the region, is to nurture a common vision of the future of the region, and to invest, not just China, but all countries in the region, in the idea that maintaining a common set of principles, common set of rules and norms is what allows for predictability, what preserves stability. And when those things start to break down, when there are countries that selectively opt out of rules, such as freedom of navigation or peaceful resolution of disputes, what happens is size and power dictates outcomes to disputes. That leads to competition. Competition produces rivalry. And we can look at the history of the past 2 centuries to see what those outcomes are. They're often tragic. And so, it's hard, when you look at July 13th, 2016, and whether or not Cambodia received $600 million. If you look at a snapshot picture of any given day, sometimes the picture looks a little bit fuzzy, a little bit murky. If you look at the slideshow of the past several years, I think that the trend line is more positive. You see greater coalescence among ASEAN countries around principles that they all are comfortable upholding and standing behind. And I think that ultimately that will be largely determinative of the direction that the region goes. So that's the first point. The second point I would make is that China is inarguably becoming a more active global power. It has interest in parts of the world that it did not previously. It is exposed to problems in the Middle East that it did not feel previously. And as a result, it is more sensitive to events, incidents, instability in other parts of the world. That creates an overlap of interest with us because we are similarly a global power. And part of the reason, I think, structurally why there has been a uptick in cooperation on global issues is because there is an increasing overlap of interest and an increasing political will on the part of both President Xi and President Obama to act on those converging interests. But I'll stop there.
Great. Taylor, while we're still in the sunshine.
Sure, I would just, great question. I think it's actually only $60 million, not 600, so it's quite a good deal from China's perspective. But actually wasn't important, okay? Because the ASEAN still issued a statement that had six paragraphs on the South China Sea that I think underscored sort of what Ryan was talking about before, that there's a lot of, there's basically a much larger concern about China's behavior and the implications that has for their own futures. And the way in which the ruling was structured is actually quite favorable to all of the other countries as well. So it was really a victory for coastal states, because what the tribunal said was no land feature in the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea constitutes an island under international law that can generate a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. And so what that did was sort of evaporate the legal basis for claims that China has made and has made subsequently, but also consolidated the claims of the coastal states. Vietnam and Philippines in particular, right, can claim out to 200 nautical miles. But the more general issues that the regional, the smaller states in the region are in a very precarious situation because on the one hand they have to worry about China in terms of the territorial disputes. On the other hand, they have to worry about China because their economies have become increasingly dependent on them. They're not large enough that they can they can stand up to China alone, so they need to find ways to cooperate. And then the one organization that exists in the region, ASEAN, happens to include basically two different groups of countries: those who are coastal states who have maritime boundaries and thus interests in the South China Sea, and those who only have land boundaries with China, who have a very different set of interests. So it's a tough organization upon which I think to do too much. You do raise an important point about not excluding what the rest of the region is thinking and how they respond to this.
And Kelly, two questions about individuals, actually, the role of Rudd and the role of Xi's own personal knowledge, expertise.
Well, I would say about Kevin Rudd, he's a very astute observer of both the United States and China. I can say that these negotiations were very strictly just U.S.-China negotiations. No other parties were aware of them, at least that we know of on the U.S. side. But I think there's a more general point to be made about Kevin Rudd, which is that, and a point I was trying to make in my remarks, that for all of us who study and spend time in the other countries and do work forming relationships and building trust and engaging in longer term conversations, you can seed a lot of ideas. I mean, you can learn a lot, and you can also, begin to nurture ideas. And so who knows if he was, one of the people who seeded ideas in this respect. But all of us can do that, actually, in our daily work. With respect to Xi Jinping, or I would say more generally the leadership in China, I think there's a hugely different feeling there about climate change. There's no debate about the existence of a problem, the need to act. I think the conversation in China is much more about how do we do this in a way that is responsible for China, right? How do we do this in a way that is mindful of the fact we still have millions of people living in poverty, that we rely very heavily on coal, that this will be a difficult transition. So that's the debate, and that rightfully is taking place, but not about the accuracy of the science or anything like that. So it's a really different conversation, and that's why, to me, the challenge in China is a much more real socioeconomic, technical challenge. In the United States, it's primarily a political challenge.
So why don't we go back to questions? And I know Steve is getting lonely, so a Taiwan question would be great.
Your report that involved Taiwan. Taiwan question of Taiwan belong to Cold War, or began with Cold War. Cold War had passed 24 years ago in Europe. We couldn't return Cold War. Would you please tell me Taiwan question? What will be well decided? Thank you.
This side. Yes, sir. The back.
Ed Baker with the Korea Institute. I think this is to Mr. Haas. I came in a couple of minutes late, and I'm not sure if you said anything about U.S. China discussions about North Korea, but I wish you could comment on that. We often hear that in the United States that, you know, the U.S. should pressure China into pressuring North Korea to stop behaving badly. China, on the other hand, says that this is something that has to be negotiated and that the U.S. should stop putting so much pressure on North Korea and being so threatening toward North Korea. I wonder if there is any basis for agreement. Is anything happening on this issue?
Let's take one more question. Yeah, no, right next to you. Right next to you, yeah.
I also have a Taiwan question. So I was struck by your phrasing that the U.S. is sort of an equal opportunity obstructor in this situation. And by the way, I'm sorry, I'm Eric Hunman from Dartmouth College. But I wanted to get your thoughts on how sustainable you think that is from the U.S. perspective. We've seen at least one prominent call to sort of give up Taiwan for the U.S. Is this kind of sort of being a burr in both sides a sustainable position for the U.S. in the future?
All right, so 2 Taiwan questions and a question for you, Ryan, too.
Well, I guess the first question about the outcome. Both sides, I think, know the dangers of any foolish move. And it really depends on the patience and good sense of both sides of the Taiwan Strait. For the mainland, it just has to be patient that this is not going to be solved immediately, and that they might think about other solutions. For Taiwan, I think the lesson is pretty clear, that independence in a de jure sense, meaning international recognition of its sovereign nature internationally, is not something they can simply declare, because that is the mainland's red line. Now, the mainland talks about soft independence. It talks about peaceful separation. The anti-secession law talks about very vague terms about if these things go on too long. So there's, there's plenty of reason to be worried that each side might just lose patience with the present status quo. But they both know the dangers, and they both know it would be a terrible mistake to do that. But it is not the current position that each side takes is irreconcilable. There is no solution. They're too far apart. So do you tolerate that or don't you tolerate that? The United States is a burr in both sides. I think it's true. I think that we are positioned in such a way as to make it very clear that there can be no unilateral solution to this. And that the status quo, as unstable and dangerous as that may be, is what we support. So yes, I mean, if you think of what is keeping Taiwan out of the international system as an international actor, it's the blame is shared between the United States and China. We are both preventing Taiwan from realizing its ambition. But that's the way we keep the peace. mean, the odd thing about Taiwan, and some of you have heard me say this before, is that we have a possible commitment to defend a regime on an island that the status of which we think is unsettled, ruled by a regime that we don't recognize. It's weird. But that's the situation, and that's a burr in everybody's side.
Right? I think there was a question about the
On the
DPRK.
Korea question.
Yeah.
So I would just offer 3 very quick comments. I know we're running short on time. First, on the issue of North Korea, I think that when our 2 leaders sit down and talk about North Korea, there's broad agreement on the outcome that we seek. Where there is ongoing discussion is what is the best pathway to get to that outcome. And that's a discussion that's ongoing in New York, in Washington, and in Beijing, including as we speak. And it will be ongoing for the foreseeable future. North Korea is a central feature of our bilateral discussions, including at the highest levels. So that would be the first thought. The second thought is that China has put more pressure on North Korea in the past year, year and a half, 2 years than it has, for a very long time. The dilemma is that pressure appears to be insufficient to alter Kim Jong-un's strategic calculus. And so that's the snapshot of where we are at the moment. It's very difficult for me to predict where we will be in the future. But what I am confident about is that we will continue to be very actively engaged with Beijing in finding a way that we both can try to address this issue in a constructive way that hopefully compels Kim Jong-un to alter his behavior.
Well, thanks very much. We've run out of time. I just wanted to say that in Confucius, and this is not an orientalizing comment, so Confucius actually did say this. Namely, he said, 三人行必有我师焉. So when 3 people are walking along the road, amongst them must be a teacher, and in this case, it's 四人行. So I wanted everyone to thank the panel. It was a tremendous learning experience for me. Hopefully it was as well for you. And these are real experts in all of these topics. And they underscored, I think, the theme of the panel, namely the complexity of the U.S. China relationship and the fact that it can't be reduced to particular terms, particular characterizations, because that ends up missing both areas of cooperation that are absolutely momentous, namely climate change, as well as areas of competition where the 2 sides have very conflicting interests. And so thank you very much for coming, and let's give them a round of applause.